Allow me to introduce to you after this great sessions, now the last keynote speaker, Dr. Thomas Cauvin. He has French roots and is since 2020 working as an associate professor at Luxembourg University. He's in charge of the project Public History as the New Citizen Science of the Past at the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, promoting history in public spaces. Thomas earned his PhD at the European University Institute in Italy in 2012 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan in 2013. He became an assistant professor of history at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette and obtained in 2017 a professorate at Colorado State University in the United States also. But until 2020, just a year ago, he was in charge of the Public History and Museum Program. Thomas Cauvin has been the president of the International Federation for Public History since 2018, and he is the author of a Public History, a textbook of practice, which was published in 2016. Today, and that will become not as a surprise, he will present a talk on the fall of monuments as an event and as a manifestation of public history. I give the floor to Thomas, please.
All right, thank you, Henry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, all right, so I'm gonna start sharing my screen and you can tell me if you can see it. Can you just confirm you see it? All right, so thank you everybody for still being with us. I don't know if it's more difficult to start a conference or to end a conference. We'll see with your questions and your remarks. So I want to thank the organizer and a special thank for Hanno and Eva for the great work you've been doing. It's a very impressive conference. It's very humbling because I've learned a lot and it's a very smooth conference with great feedback. So I appreciate your invitation to be part of it. I always think it's important to know where historians come from to understand their history and their topic. And there are, I think, a few things that connect me with monuments. First, I did my PhD on Irish history, and Irish have a love and hate relationship with monuments, as we discovered this morning with the pillar and with other monuments. I've also been working in the United States for 7 years, especially in Louisiana, and they also have a love and hate relationship with some monuments. So when I was teaching there, I had to deal with monuments because, and that's the third aspect, I'm interested in doing public history. So you may not be familiar with the term of public history, and I will kind of explain. But public history is a way of doing history within the public. And monuments are a great topic, great problem-solving cases and training for students. So I chose to connect monuments and public history and see if it adds anything to the discussion, to the great discussion we've had since this morning, and other works from historians. So does history help understand why monuments are destroyed or removed? You have a few examples here that we have seen already today. Bristol in England, or Columbus, Christopher Columbus in Argentina, bottom left, or James Cook in Australia. So monuments are subject of discussion, to say the least. So the question is, does public history help to understand those debates? What's the role of an historian today when we talk about removing monuments? And what can historians bring to the discussion? So we'll see if some of those answers can be answered today. But first of all, what's public history? As you have understood from Hanno's nice introduction, I'm interested in public history. I'm doing public history, and I develop public history network. So what is public history? Public history, I consider, is a way of doing history. It's not a topic, it's a way of doing history that is with the public. So we're going to talk about public participation. What can people say or do about monuments? It's also doing history for large audiences, so communication, So it's a way of doing history which is trying to be even more public. And I came up with this design of a public history, first because I love the play word on public history and public history. But I also think that it symbolizes what public history can be. Public history as a process of doing history with roots is when we collect sources, we preserve sources, and those could be monuments. The trunk is the traditional role of historians. We interpret sources from the past, right? But public history is also branches communicating history through podcasts, exhibitions, monuments as well. And finally, you have leaves, how those histories are used by people, right? And all those aspects are connected in public history. At least that's my understanding. So let's see how this tree of public history can highlight the discussion and debates about monuments. And I should say right now that I'm actually providing less answers than questions in my talk. So don't be disappointed if I don't have all the answers to those questions. And basically, what can historians bring to the discussion, right? In this context in which, as historians, Ludmila Jordanova wrote in a few years ago, 20 years ago, the past is more than ever, let me move the video. The past is more than ever considered as a public property, subject to many different interpretations. So what does that mean, that the past is public property? And what does that mean to have many different interpretations for monuments? I think that's a key issue that we're dealing with in public history, and that monuments, debates about monuments connect to as well. So I think, let me move my slides. I think one question first is, what can historians bring to the discussion of monuments? Some aspects are obvious, and I'm not the first one by no means to say that. Others are maybe more innovative. So it's not a surprise. Historians work with sources, and we study the past through sources. So when we train our students, monuments can be sources as well. When I was teaching in Colorado, we had this course on monuments. And the question was, how can I train my students to interview monuments? And I use that expression, interviewing a monument. I was asking my students, you have to choose one monument as a source, and you have to interview that monument. So I came up with a few guidelines for them, because it's a very vague process, interviewing a monument. So I came up with a few things that other historians have used before, or sociologists or art historians. So I'm not by any means the first one to use those, but I was asking my students about the context of construction, and we're gonna see that's very important to understand the changing role of monuments. So who was paying for the monuments, for example, or when was it built, or what parts were added after the monument was built. The second type of question was the visual aspects and the spatial aspect of the monuments. So the imagery, the color, the type of stone that the monuments are made of, the size, the scale, the text, the space as well. Is it in front of a church? Is it in front of a courthouse? Space matters too. So I wanted my students to analyze all those items to use and to interview the monument as a source. And the uses as well, because we've seen that monuments are used like pilgrimage, like tourism. So uses were also part of their study of monuments, because I do think that we should train our students to decipher a monument and using monument as a source. And this could be done with the public too. Historians could help people to understand that monuments are not the past. Monuments are sources about certain aspects of the past. And knowing that, my students had to decipher a monument like this one, for example, which is a very famous fascist monument in Italy. And interviewing that monument tells us not only about the monument, but about the fascist ideology, that the group matters much more than the individual, and that that the similarity of the group and the fact there is no individual liberty, for example, is in the monument as well. So studying monument as sources is important for students. As historians, we should not be surprised by the next slide. Context matters, right? So this is on the background of that slide, you see a very useful survey that was made in the US about all Confederate symbols. So schools, monuments, and other site like names and so on a chronology. And I've used that with my students to show that monuments about the Civil War tell us much more about when they were built than about the Civil War itself. You can see, for example, that most of the Confederate monuments were built between the 1900 and 1920, right? Which is in the US a very important period of national identity. The KKK and all this white supremacy ideology developed in the 1910s. So you have a direct connection between the white supremacists, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, and building monuments about the Civil War, right? So you need to put those monuments into context, which is obvious for historians, but not for most of people. And you see a second turn in the 1960s. You see more monuments in the 1960s in connection with the civil rights movement, because monuments about the Confederates were also built to answer the civil rights. So it's important for historians to show that the context matters and that context can explain monuments. But it goes beyond context and beyond sources. So we also need to work with our students, with public groups to explain how our views of monuments have changed. And this is those are two examples that the first one was covered this morning with a very traditional 19th century monument. So that's Nelson's Column in London, 1843. And on the right, you have a way more recent monument in London about the women of World War II. And you can totally see the changing function that people who build the monuments attributed to those monuments. In 19th century, Nelson is, you cannot reach him. It's like a heroic figure looking at people. So this is this very elitist vision of national identity that you cannot reach. It's like the heroic leader, the great man looking at us. Whereas for the 2005 monument, it's about everyday people, women. You see different types of workers, nurses with no corpse. So there's also the concept of absence in 2005. And if you see the space, you can reach the monument, which is very different from the 19th century. So our conception of what a monument should be have changed too. And you can do that history too. And the discrepancy between the function attributed to the monument when it was built and our conception of what the monument should be is at the origin of tensions. This is why some monuments are obviously dismantled or even destroyed. This is this comparison or discrepancy between the function given at the beginning to the monument, the symbols of the monuments, and what we or what groups want today. This changing function of monuments have been studied. One of the most famous examples is the concept of counter monuments that we just also saw in the previous sessions. It's a quote from James Young, The Texture of Memory, that I will briefly read. The result of the postmodern shift has been a metamorphosis of the monument from the heroic, so Nelson, self-aggrandizing figurative icons of the 19th century, celebrating national ideals and triumphs, to the anti-heroic, often ironic and self-effacing conceptual installations, making the national ambivalence an insanity of late 20th century postmodernism. So the conception, the functions of monuments have changed. And this, you can do the history of that, but you can also explain why our memories and groups now have some tensions with this heroic great men, white only, representation from the 19th century. So this discrepancy is important to understand our reaction with monuments. Something also very important in public history is public space. And there is a direct connection between monument and public space that I want to discuss in my next slide. So monument controlling space with, this is a picture of Cecil Rhodes statue on the University of Cape Town, South Africa, that we have used. So I asked my students to discuss with Atabile, who was a student from South Africa, who took part in the campaign of removing Cecil Rhodes' statue in South Africa. And one argument from Atabile explaining why he took part in this campaign was that he saw the statue every day, and he saw the statue looking at him, and he thought that for him, Cecil Rhodes' statue was controlling the space where he was going every day, on the hill, on the campus, on the University of Cape Town. And this connection between the statue and space, this colonial construction of space, was something very important for Atabile in his decision to take part in the protest to remove Cecil Rhodes' statue. And I think we can't understand the reaction from people about monuments without this connection between the statue, monuments, and space. And this is sometimes very subtle, but very often super important. To give you one example, this is a monument, a Confederate monument in Georgia, the United States. So 1908, it matches the chronology that I gave you before. But what's more important is the background. This monument is in front of the courthouse, and there's no coincidence. The monument was built there as a political message to everybody, especially Black people, but everybody going to the courthouse as a message that we, the Confederate, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy control the space. So look at us before you go to the courthouse. So it's not only about remembering the Civil War, it's a political message that you're sending to people going to the courthouse. So it is very important as a public historian to consider this control of space and the impact of monuments in their surrounding area. Now I'm going into the difficult questions of what to do with unwanted monuments, or at least when some part of the population no longer want monuments. So what do we do? What can historians do? Should they do anything? Again, sorry to kill the suspense. I don't have a once for all solution. And I think this is part of the message, and I'm going to explain why. Historians work with context, right? So facts happen in the context. There is no way for us to have a general solution for all monuments because they are apart from different contexts. We cannot have the same solution for Cecil Rhodes' statue in South Africa than the one in Oxford in England. Or you cannot have the same reaction with Cecil Rhodes' statue and Columbus statue in Argentina. So that's the first thing. There is no single solution because context matters. It's not something we can do in our research and disregard when we deal with public discussion. So what about monuments that are displaced? Because as I said, something problematic with monuments is their relation with space. So having this monument from New Orleans, the Liberty Place Monument, which is about a revolt in the 1870s from white supremacists. Let's make things simple. This monument was on one of the main streets of New Orleans. And that was a problem because it's a message supporting white supremacists in the center of the town. So the decision was made to move that monument into a parking space. So then the meaning of the monument is very different. The next step was to move this monument in storage. That's what city councils say when they don't want to deal with a monument, we put in storage. Right? So the connection between the monument is the space is what matters, much more than the initial meaning of the monument. And you have many solutions to break this link between the monument and its space. Another very famous example is the Memento Park in Hungary, close to Budapest, that collects or gathers Soviet monuments. You have the one in front of you about Lenin, you have some about Stalin, and the park was collecting monuments, Soviet monuments from all over Hungary in one place. And we had a discussion with the curators, with my students, and one of his problems was that this created some sort of pilgrimage. And so you displaced the problem. You had people coming to worship Lenin and Stalin, which is fine in itself. But can you imagine doing this with a monument to Mussolini in Italy? There is no way you collect monuments to Mussolini. You would create a pilgrimage with possibly neo-fascist Italians. So this is not a sustainable solution. This is something that's been done in Hungary, but has its own problem because you're creating a new space and a new function to monuments. Still working on space and monuments. I've heard, I think it was in one of the sessions this afternoon, the discussion about monuments in museums. And that's often the easy solution for politicians. Let's put monuments in museums. This is not a sustainable solution. You have thousands of Confederate monuments in the US. There is no way you put those monuments, all those monuments in museums. And again, it's not something sustainable in the sense that museums are not a place where you put things when you no longer want those objects. But still, there's some interesting discussion about putting monuments in a museum. And I want to take one example, which is a Confederate monument from Texas. It's a Jefferson Davis monument on the campus of the University of Texas in Austin. The university decided that they no longer wanted a Confederate monument on their campus. So they decided to move that 3-meter high monument to their museum. It was easy because it was the university museum. So it's not exceptional, but what I like in that example is the space control on the monument. In the exhibition, they created a specific exhibition for the monument with other sources, letters, cartoons, images, maps to interpret Jefferson Davis and the memory and the changing meaning of Jefferson Davis over the century. This is a historical job of interpreting and contextualizing the monument that can be useful. And I could see the benefit of that. I know we can't do that for every monument, but that's a thing that historians could help with, creating a space of interpretation in a museum. But also sometimes museums use surprising monuments. You may know that the Congo country, the Republic of Congo, was colonized by Belgium. And so during the colonization of the country, many statues of Leopold II were erected in Congo and Brazzaville. And when Mobutu came to power after independence, he obviously removed all of the statues of Leopold II, but they were not all destroyed. You see here one statue of Leopold II that is now in the National Museum of Congo. So they moved back the monument and reinterpreted the memory and the history of Leopold II to fit the national history of Congo. So reusing a symbol of colonization in their own history and their own interpretation of the past. So you can see that the control of the monument has deeply changed since the colonization of the Congo. Again, this is something that is not uncommon. What is more problematic, and I would like to finish with that, is the fact in public history, when you work with people, with different groups, you end up with different interpretations of the past. And monuments are no different. You have people having different interpretation of monuments. So what to do with different interpretation of the same monuments? Or when you have groups fighting over the future of one monument? This is a very difficult question, and I don't pretend to have solutions, but I have some ideas. So what to do with different interpretations? I'm not talking about statements that are not true. I'm talking about different but valid interpretation of a same event or a same monument. For example, Jefferson, the US president, not Jefferson Davis, Jefferson, the president. He was one of the fathers of the US constitutions. He was developing democratic practices. He was also a slave owner. So you have people who want to remember Jefferson as a great father of the US nation, and other people say, well, wait, he was also a slave owner, right? And those interpretations were right, both are right. So what to do about the statue of Jefferson when you have different people who disagree with that? Even more difficult, what to do with a class when I ask my students to deal with a very practical problem. In the city, we had a Confederate monuments. This monument was about someone who was a heroic local hero, but he was also a slave owner. So I asked my students, what do we do and how do we contribute to the discussion, which is a very problem-solving discussion. And the question, do we work with everybody about the future of the monument? In other words, do we work with groups that are white supremacists, with some of them openly racist and having some very hatred argument? So the question is, in public history, if you work with people, do you accept everybody? Who decides whom to work with? If you don't work with white supremacists, then you have a bias because they're part of the population. On the other hand, do I want my students to be confronted with white supremacists and some very racist discussion? In the end, we did not work with them. But my point is that the choice of not working with them was part of the discussion and part of the process. I think we need to openly evaluate how our choice of working with people and not other impact the history that we make. And this, we had a great discussion with my students about the fact that white supremacists are not in the discussion, how that impacts their vision and decision on the monuments. And the last one in a minute, because I know I'm running out of time, is you've had some people who have discussed that question of the complexity of the past, having different interpretation of one monument or one event. And the concept of sedimented histories by Julian Moore and Lloyd is very useful. It is a way of having different interpretation in one narrative. So for example, saying that Jefferson was both a US president and a slave owner, or the fact that you may have very different interpretation of the First World War if you were on the home front, if you were a black soldier in England. So she came up with this idea of having sedimented histories when you have different interpretation of a singular event, still based on historical research. So what does it, and I'm concluding now, what does it tell us about the difficult public history of monuments? It tells us that we need to show and work about the past, that's for sure, but we also need to work with present groups and present situation and the future as well in a very problem-solving practice. This is something I like my students to work on, a problem-solving approach of what to do with monuments, with not one single solution. And contributing to the fact that, as Jordanova said, the past is a public property. So it's not only for historians to decide what the past should be and what monuments, where monuments should go. I think I'm gonna stop here, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for this inspiring talk.
Thank you, Hanno. Thank you, Thomas. It was very inspiring. But I was wondering, because at the end you say we decided not to discuss with supremacists, racists, which of course I can understand. But we also have the case when there are two different, let's say, democratic lecture. And so how do you deal with this? Because some statues are considered as unacceptable by groups while they are acceptable by other ones. And those two meanings can be relevant. So my question should be, who owns the past in this perspective?
Thank you, Chantal, for even making the question more complex with who owns the past, which is a very light question. Yeah, you're right. I mentioned the white supremacist because it's an easy example, but my point is not to choose between white supremacist or, let's say, pro-civil rights. My point is that whatever you choose impacts your history, and that your choice should be part of the process and the project, and evaluate how your choice affect the final historical narratives, right? So I don't have an answer about choosing who should be part of the discussion. Definitely, historians do not control that. Because if you say who owns the past, not historians, and I don't think that owning the past is a very useful concept. But I think that the choice and the design of the project is what matters the most. And this design should be also part of the reflection that we have, right? And deciding what power, what groups has, or whom historians like to work with, because sometimes we assume that we are neutral, but the choice we make when we work with a museum, with a group, with partners is not neutral. And those choices are in themselves the project and the history that we are making. So again, I don't have a solution, but I think what matters is to have those choices as part of the discussion and part of the project, and to have them openly discussed and published as well in books and exhibition, why you chose to work with them and not with them. And that has an impact, because if we don't do that, we're not fair, and we don't even acknowledge our choice, not neutrality.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I see Iris Pupella-Nogues wanting to pose two questions. Try to combine them a bit so that it doesn't appear like two questions.
Right. Okay. I will try. Thank you very much. No, I just it was a very interesting presentation, Professor Cauvin, of course. I had one reflection more than a question. Sorry. It's just that I remember, and you might all of you remember that when Robert Musil in The Man Without Qualities said that there is no such thing as invisible than monuments. And I was questioning myself for this question of the invisibility of monuments, because I think when you deal with monuments, when you study them, it's always on a longue durée now, in a very long time, because you can see, and in all this presentation of today, we saw that it's for a very long time, a monument doesn't make any vague, I don't know, it doesn't make any reactions. It only melted on the landscape, on the urban landscape. And then suddenly you have crisis, and you have political crisis, such as La Commune, that we talk about this morning. But when you consider the Roads Must Fall movement, it was like in 2015, or even the Black Lives Matter movement on the summer 2020, we might question why at this moment, at this precise moment, the monument creates a crisis, creates the willing to destroy it, or to take it away. And also, I saw in the chat that the Predapio location is a very complicated one, and I was thinking also that with the example that Professor Cauvin talked about with Budapest and the park, where all the statues are. I don't have an answer, of course, but maybe the thing that is in the park, it's quite controlled, and you can maybe bring more control with a lot of sensitive. It's a sensitive word, but at least you can add some more narratives in this park. And the problem with Predapio is that it's the tomb of Mussolini, and there's no more explanation than that. And also Predapio is the hometown. So I think the problem is also there. And the fact that the Museum of Fascism is now a project that fell out, I think, it's we have to do something about this location. So I was long, sorry, but thank you very much.
No, it's all right. Thank you, Alison. That connects to Bruno's comment on the fact that we're not all pilgrimage. That's true, but there are pilgrims, and those are the type of uses of monuments. I would tend to agree with you that having at least monuments in a control space is better, because you can create some discussion, and it's better than nothing. And the idea of a museum in Predapio instead of only the tomb was the original a very good idea. I think your comment on Cecil Road, our Road Must Fall campaign is important, because I think it's a clash. It's different layers of temporality. You have campaign groups and activists. You have the layer of the monument itself. You have the layers of the memories of the monuments. And I like this idea of clash between let's call it layers of remembrance or layers of interpretation. And sometimes those layers clash.